All right, welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. As you can probably imagine from the music you just heard, we're about to get medieval today. So, Saint Anselm was born near Aosta, Italy in 1033 AD, and he died in 1109 as the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the age of 15, he really wanted to become a monk. His father didn't approve of his plan, and so he wasn't able to formally join a monastery and become a novice until he was 27 years old. He very quickly distinguished himself as a great thinker, and he wrote one of the most famous proofs of the existence of God. And that proof of the existence of God is the subject of this video. Now, many people who believe in God do so on the basis of something like faith, or particular religious experiences that they claim to have had. In this class, we're not going to be talking about things like that. Instead, we're going to be looking at arguments for the existence of God. And in particular, in this video, I'm going to be talking about an argument that is closer to a mathematical proof than to a scientific experiment or demonstration. Now, to clarify, I want you to imagine that I've just asked you to prove to me that the sum of any two even numbers is an even number. Now, one way you could respond to my request is by giving me a bunch of examples. So 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 8 is 12, 100 plus 200 is 300, and etc. But unfortunately, there are infinitely many even numbers, and so simply providing me with a large number of examples will never be sufficient by itself to prove that the sum of any two even numbers is also an even number. The way that you could actually prove that the sum of any two numbers is an even number is to show that this result follows directly from the definition of what even numbers are. And once we reflect on what even numbers actually are, we can see that by definition, the sum of any two even numbers is an even number. So let's go through that process. All even numbers have the following general form. You might remember this from your mathematics class: m equals 2r, where r is an integer. And what this means is that if you can express a number as 2 multiplied by some integer, then it's even. For example, let 5 equal r. And we put that into the equation m equals 2r. We can see that m equals 2 times 5, and in this case, m is going to equal 10, which is an even number. We can go backwards. So let's start with an even number, 6. 6 can be expressed as 2 multiplied by the integer 3, so 6 is an even number as well because it's 2 times some integer. So it should be clear now what even numbers are. An even number is, by definition, any number that can be expressed as 2 multiplied by some integer. And therefore, all we need to do to prove that the sum of any two even numbers is an even number is to show that the sum of any two even numbers is an integer multiplied by 2. So let's do that. We're going to pick any two even numbers. So we'll say 2s and 2q, where s and q are variables that can stand for any integer. The sum of 2s and 2q is 2s plus 2q. We can factor out 2 and express it now as follows: 2 multiplied by s plus q. Here's the thing. S plus q is equal to some other integer, which we can call t. And if we substitute t into the expression, we get 2 times t. And 2 times 2 is by definition an even number no matter what t is, because it is 2 multiplied by some integer. Therefore, the sum of any two even numbers is an even number. Are you feeling lost? Well, if so, one thing you can do is you can go back and review what I just said. But here's the thing. I don't really need you to understand how this particular proof works in order to get the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making here is that understanding the nature of what even numbers are is sufficient for understanding that adding any two even numbers together results in an even number. Saint Anselm is making an argument that is analogous to this one. What he's doing is arguing that God exists by definition. If you understand enough about what God is, you'll understand that God exists. That's an extremely bold claim, so let's examine his argument for it. I just wanted to check, make sure everything was still recording. So first, let's suspend judgment about whether God exists. If we go into the inquiry assuming that God exists or assuming that God doesn't exist, we're kind of already stacking the deck. So what should we believe about God regardless of whether he exists? Well, Pegasus is a winged horse, Luke Skywalker is a Jedi, and God is a being such that we cannot conceive of any being greater than God. put it in Anselm's words, God art a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, Anselm distinguishes between something existing in the understanding and something existing in reality. Luke Skywalker exists in the understanding, but not in reality. And even though an atheist does not believe that God exists in reality, she can still believe that God exists in our understanding. God exists in our minds. Now, I want you to imagine two worlds. In World 1, Luke Skywalker exists in our understanding, but not in reality. In World 2, Luke Skywalker exists in our understanding and in reality. He's actually a real guy you can talk to in World 2. When you imagine Luke Skywalker in World 2, you are imagining something greater than when you imagine Luke Skywalker in World 1. Why? Well, because existing in the understanding and in reality is greater than merely existing in the understanding and not existing in reality. One difference between Luke Skywalker and God is that God is by definition a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And therefore, unlike Luke Skywalker, God cannot exist in the understanding alone. If God existed merely in the understanding and not in reality, then it would be possible to conceive of a being greater than God, namely a being that exists in both the understanding and reality. But since there can't be any being greater than God, God must exist in both the understanding and reality. And therefore, we've just proven that God exists. Now, Anselm isn't done yet. His next move is to prove that it is impossible to conceive of God as not existing. So not only does God exist, but it is impossible for anyone to imagine otherwise. It's pretty bold, but let's take a look at his first proof of the conclusion. So Anselm asserts that it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived to not exist. This is to say, we can imagine that a being exists that has the following property. It's impossible to imagine that this being does not exist. A being with this property is greater than a being without that property. If God did not have this property, then we could conceive of a being greater than God, a being with this property. And since no being is greater than God, God must have the property of it being such that it is impossible to believe that he doesn't exist. Now, along the same lines, Anselm argues that God is even greater than what can be conceived. We can imagine that there exists a being that is greater than what we can imagine. Such a being would be greater than any being that we could conceive of. And so therefore, God must be greater than what can be conceived. Now at this point, there's some obvious objections that I'm sure a lot of you are thinking of. And one of them goes like this. I know plenty of atheists who believe that God doesn't exist. So how can you sit here and tell me that it is impossible to conceive of God as not existing? Are you saying that atheists are capable of doing the impossible? Unsurprisingly, Anselm has a response to this objection. So according to Anselm, there is a difference between expressing a string of words and understanding what the words are expressing. It is possible for me to make the following statements. I drew a round square with 6 sides today. Fire and water are the same thing. That bachelor over there has 6 wives. But even though I can say those words, I can't really mean them because they involve contradictions. Squares are not round and they don't have 6 sides. Fire and water are not the same thing. And a bachelor is not an unmarried man because a bachelor is an unmarried man, so by definition he can't have 6 wives. In the case of God, Anselm's response to the objection is as follows. Sure, an atheist might say that they can conceive of a world without God, but when they reflect deeply on the definition of God and really explore the implications of that definition, they'll see that they can't actually conceive of a world where God does not exist. His answer to the objection, then, is that when the atheist reflects deeply on the proofs, on the meaning of the word God, they'll see that they are no different than someone who makes the other contradictory statements I just mentioned. Although the atheists can utter the words, they cannot really conceive of a world that contains the things that their words are pointing to. Now, not too long after Anselm published his proof of the existence of God, another monk named Ganillo published a rebuttal. Ganilo's rebuttal is quick and to the point. He begins by agreeing with Anselm that God is in the understanding. However, he puts pressure on Anselm's attempt to jump from the understanding to reality. To quote Ganilo, "For he who says that this being exists because otherwise the being which is greater than all will not be greater than all does not attend strictly enough to what he is saying. For I do not yet say, no, I even deny or doubt that this being is greater than any real object. Nor do I concede to it any other existence than this, if it should be called existence, which it has when the mind, according to a word merely heard, tries to form the image of an object absolutely unknown to it." So in other words, when an object exists in my mind, I'm not going to compare that object in terms of greatness to objects that exist out there in the world. If you want to compare the greatness of God to the greatness of other things that exist out there in the world, you need to first show me that God exists in reality and not merely in your mind and my mind. It's illegitimate to conclude that an object exists in the real world based on nothing more than the details of my mental representation of it. You need evidence that it actually exists, or some other form of proof that it actually exists. Now, Ganilo then goes on to present what I think is one of the sassiest roasts in the history of philosophy. And his writing is so clear that I'm just going to recite it to you. So it goes something like this, quote, "For example, it is said that somewhere in the ocean is an island, which because of the difficulty, or rather the impossibility of discovering what does not exist, is called the Lost Island. And they say that this island has an inestimable wealth of all manner of riches and delicacies in greater abundance than is told of the islands of the blessed. And that having no owner or inhabitant is more excellent than all other countries which are inhabited by mankind in the abundance with which it is stored. Now, if someone should tell me that there is such an island, I should easily understand his words, in which there is no difficulty. But suppose that he went on to say, as if by logical inference, and here's a quote within the quote, you can no longer doubt that this island, which is more excellent than all islands, exists somewhere, since you have no doubt that it is in your understanding, and since it is more excellent not to be in the understanding alone, but to exist in both the understanding and reality, for this reason it must exist. For if it does not exist, any land which really exists will be more excellent than it, and so the island already understood by you to be more excellent will not be more excellent." Here's the end of the quote within the quote. But going on with Ganilo's quote, if a man should try to prove to me by such reasoning that this island truly exists and that its existence should no longer be doubted, either I should believe that he was jesting, or I know not which I ought to regard as the greater fool, myself for supposing I should allow this proof, or him if he should suppose that he had established with any certainty the existence of the island. For he ought to show first that the hypothetical excellence of this island exists as a real and indubitable fact, and in no wise as any unreal object, or one whose existence is uncertain in my understanding." So that's the end of the quote from Ganilo. So as you might expect, Anselm has a response to Ganilo. Ganilo's lost island is not a being than which no greater being can be conceived. God, on the other hand, is a being than which no greater being can be conceived. And Anselm puts the point like this: anyone who says that they conceive of God as not existing is doing one of two things. One thing they might be doing is imagining a version of God such that it's possible for someone else to be greater than God. This is to say they're imagining a conception of God that doesn't exist in reality and only in the mind, and therefore is less great than a conception of God that does exist in reality, and therefore that person is failing to conceive of God, according to the true definition of God that Anselm's proposing. The other thing they could be doing is just forming sentences with words without actually conceiving of anything at all, be it God's existence or non-existence. So this was our first investigation into a proof of the existence of God. I started by telling you about proofs in general. Then I presented Anselm's proof of the existence of God. Then I showed you Ganilo's rebuttal to Anselm, and I concluded with Anselm's response to Ganilo's rebuttal. Now, there's something I want you to do. I want you to take some time to think about the arguments that you've just explored. I want you to go back to the primary texts, and I want you to see if you can find the arguments in those texts. Then I want you to explain the arguments to someone else. That's the true test of whether you understand something. If you can explain it to somebody else and help them understand it, then you really understand it. And then finally, after you're sure that you've understood the arguments and that you can express them as good or even better than Anselm and Gaunello did hundreds of years ago, I want you to critically evaluate them. Once you understand them, once you can express them, I want you to think carefully about whether Anselm's proof succeeds. Do you find Gaunello's rebuttal convincing? What about Anselm's response to Gaunello's rebuttal? Now, to be clear, I am not asking you whether you believe in God, nor am I telling you whether I believe in God, although I'm happy to talk to you about all of that and more if you come to office hours. Office hours are a really fun time. You should come. It's just fun. We can talk about philosophy or wherever else. But to be clear, the only thing I'm asking you to do here is to join a conversation that's been going on in philosophy for thousands of years by reflecting deeply on an argument that was invented by a monk a couple hundred years ago.